Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. And this is a podcast with a difference because tonight we're in the august surroundings of the University of Glasgow, and you will notice that on the panel here we have not just Alec and myself, but Professor Chris Carman, who's going to be inviting questions from our studio audience tonight. And again, a little bit of a difference because we'll do the usual warbling for 45 minutes, but then about 40 minutes where the people who've come to listen to our warblings are going to get the chance to dispute our analysis, tell us that we're talking absolute rubbish, and more importantly, give their perspective in the run-up to 2026. So over the course of the next 3/4 of an hour, we want to try and establish what the terrain will be that the election will be fought on, what the polls are saying, what the outcome may well be, and to look after the election, what the arithmetic may well be for the governance of Scotland. So a pretty broad canvas in the run-up to 2026. Alex, if you had to sort of make any predictions, are we set up here for the biggest rainbow parliament since the Parliament of 2003?
Well, if you look at all the opinion polls, Bernard, over the last year now, then that seems quite clearly, likely to be the case. We have a situation where it is established that the SNP remain the most popular party in Scotland, but their popularity is not what it was 4 or 5 years ago. If you think of the SNP currently polling around 35% of the vote, and so on, that is down a dozen points from where they were last time around, and those votes have to go somewhere else. A year ago, or 15 months ago, and so on, the Labour Party obviously was convinced that it was springtime for Sawar. That on the back of a general election victory in Scotland, that would be a catapult for Labour to thrive at the Holyrood election next year. It's reasonable, I think, to suggest that events haven't quite developed in the way that Mr Sawar and his party hoped they might. The Labour Party currently now finds itself in a fight for second place, according to all the available opinion polls, which have been quite steady and stable for really a prolonged period of time now. The rise of reform in Scotland, which we'll talk about in more detail, I'm sure, later, and so on, challenges all the established parties, and it seems quite obvious that barring some kind of unanticipated, unforeseeable meltdown, that reform will become a sizable presence in the next Parliament, in the same way as we would expect, I think, again, looking at the current polls, that the Greens and the Liberal Democrats could have good results, which by a process of elimination means that it must also be winter for Russell Findlay and the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party. So to that extent, you're right. So this is an election which, as matters currently stand, and of course a lot can change in the next 6 months, as matters currently stand, however, yes, you would expect there to be a wider range of parties represented at Holyrood than at any point in really, nearly the last 20 years.
I mean, I sort of cast my mind back to 2010 when Labour, in a UK sense, lost power. But in 2010, Labour had a very, very good night in Westminster constituencies in Scotland. And Ian Gray probably at that time thought it's just a case of keeping the show on the road, doing nothing particularly radical that will scale the electoral horses, wait a year and everything will be fine. And of course, 1 year down the line, the SNP bust the electoral system and get the victory which provided the springboard for the independence referendum. And if we flip back to the day after the general election last year, again, a fantastic night for Labour. And as Sawar must have been thinking what Ian Gray was thinking in 2010. And John Swinney at that point was probably thinking, what have I let myself in for? So I suppose the lesson is that it's partly horses for courses and a lot can change. And one of the factors which is leading to change, I suppose, and we really should talk about that, and I would be very interested when we go to audience questions and observations, by the way. We're not just looking for questions, we're looking for observations.
Short observations,
short observations. Is the Reform UK dynamic. I mean, if I'd been doing my old job and I'd been taking a camera down Sucky Hall Street and I'd been stopping people, and if I'd said to them, do you know who Nigel Farage is? The chances are that everybody would say they knew who Nigel Farage is. If I had to say to them, do you know who Reform UK is? The chances are that they would all say that they've heard of Reform UK. If I said to them, would you consider, in certain circumstances, voting for Reform UK? Again, the polls are suggesting this. Quite a lot of people would suggest that they would consider voting for Reform UK. If I then asked them, did you ever vote for Margaret Thatcher? They'd probably take a swing for me. They would probably take a swing. And if I had to say to them, do you realise that Nigel Farage, in terms of his politics, is way to the right of Margaret Thatcher in terms of liberalising markets, cutting the state down to size, perhaps moving to a social insurance system for the National Health Service?
Stop talking him up. Stop talking him up, Bernard. You make it sound far more appealing.
They would think that you were talking absolute madness. So the issue, I suppose, and let me get your view on this. I mean, clearly the support for Reform UK is a plague in all their houses. It's a sense in which the political mainstream, whether it be moderately centre-right or centre-left, this feeling of exasperation that government doesn't work for the voters. So, if Anas Sarwar was sitting here, I would say to him, on the issue of immigration, the more you talk about it, and the more the Home Secretary comes out with ever more tougher measures, you remind people of Reform's raison d'etre. And if you turn the election next year or invite it to be an emotion on the issue of people being disenchanted with politics, you're going to do Reform's job for them. Why don't you take Reform on their broader politics?
Well, I mean, to some extent, I think that's what Labour would say that they are doing. Actually, that's what the Home Secretary is doing. That's certainly her view is that whether people in the Labour Party and Labour Party voters and activists, whether they like it or not, it is a fact that at the moment, rightly or not, fairly or not, reasonably or not, immigration has become an extremely salient issue in British politics. And you can't just ignore that. There was one Labour MP who was criticising the Home Secretary this week for appeasing the electorate. Well, at a certain point, at a certain level, that's what politicians have to do. If you go around the country telling the electorate they are idiots and they know nothing and their concerns are all nonsensical, then you can't be surprised if the electorate turns around and says, well, we're not voting for you. And that is one of the things I think that Labour are trying to achieve at a UK level here and so on. It's about lancing a boil, is how I think they would see it, and also addressing the reality of the fact that the immigration system and the asylum system in particular is obviously not working, not functioning the way it should at the moment. So I have some sympathy for the Home Secretary on that. But I also think that in terms of reform, but you talked about how reform is essentially a sensibility, a plague on all houses. We don't like the Tories, we don't like Keir Starmer. In Scotland, we don't like the SNP either, and everybody is a disappointment. Let's blow everything up and start again. There's a sort of nihilistic quality to it. I would suggest to you that the concerns about immigration are a symptom of that broader disenchantment and disillusionment rather than a cause of it. And that's why, confronting any kind of populist movement of the sort that reform is and so on. And again, you see analogues to reform in lots of other European countries. So this is not purely a Scottish or a British phenomenon and so on. It's a problem, or it's a situation that you can find in almost every other Western European country at present. It is very difficult to confront populist parties of left and right alike head on. I think you have to I would suggest this, you have to confront them obliquely, and the way you do that is by making the state work, is by governing well and effectively. and thereby you reduce the push towards those parties. And that is where I would suggest that Keir Starmer in particular is having difficulties. And those difficulties then trickle down for Anas Sarwar, don't they? Because he was supposed to ride on the Starmer and Reeves coattails, and just as they swept into Downing Street, he would piggyback on them, if you like, to mix metaphors, and use that as his way into Bute House, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point to, if you're a unionist party contesting an election at the Scottish Parliament, there's a sense in which you can't hermetically seal your Scottish offering to the voters. If you're a unionist party, people will look at what the party is doing south of the border, particularly if that party has to be in government. I mean, the Liberal Democrats in Scotland have taken a complete and utter pasting for a number of years. To a certain extent, it is only at the election coming up that they're coming out of the drubbings that they have been getting at election after election, the price that they were paying for the Liberal Democrats going into coalition with the Conservatives at Westminster. And although the Lib Dems have always managed to hold on to some of the rural seats, I mean, if you dig down into sort of share of the vote across the country, in whole swathes of West Central Scotland, at election after election after election, it's lost deposit after lost deposit after lost deposit. The Lib Dems, Scottish Lib Dems, ceased, frankly, to be a national political party some time ago. That, in part, was nothing to do with what Tavish Scott or Willie Rennie was doing in Scotland. It was the price that they paid for the decisions that Nick Clegg was taking in London. Similarly, with the Scottish Conservatives during COVID, there was this utter sense of frustration that they were tanking, not on the basis of what they were saying in the Scottish Parliament. They were taking a tanking because of a reaction to Boris Johnson. And I mean, you're absolutely right that the dynamics might have been different had Labour not made such a mess of it in the last year and a half. Now, I don't criticise Keir Starmer or Rachel Reeves up to a point. It was a good election for the Conservatives to lose because the inheritance was absolutely, truly awful. And there's probably a sense that even if they'd got everything right, even if they hadn't made any obvious mistakes, there's a sense, because this was a big ask and a difficult ask in terms of delivering for working people, and he knew would set in and probably fairly quickly. So this was always a tough ask for Labour. It's almost being made an impossible ask because of the rank incompetence in particular of Keir Starmer. And question to you, just on the point of the Labour dynamic from London and the contagion in Scotland, anybody that listens to the podcast on a regular basis will know that it has been my view for some time. He will not lead Labour into the next general election. It is only a question, what is the tipping point in order to push him? Now, from the point of view of getting rid of him, from a UK perspective, that time is next May. But from Anas Sarwar's perspective, he must be privately hoping that the tipping point is a further run on the ratings after the budget on the 26th.
Well, I think you could forgive Anas for thinking actually the time for a change was about 9 months ago. I mean, people often ask us on this question, what could Scottish Labour do in terms of the, you're right about the tensions that there are between the party in Scotland and the party at a British level. And you have lots of people offering what they doubtless consider to be well-meaning advice and so on, that Scottish Labour must differentiate itself from Keir Starmer's government. And you could, have a separate, distinct, bespoke Scottish offer and so on. He must pick some fights with the Prime Minister and be seen to win those fights, ideally. I mean, people, newspaper columnists were struggling for something to write about this is a very easy column to write. And loads of people have done it repeatedly. I probably have myself at some point. But it's fundamentally misguided, I would suggest to you about it, because then you're going into an election as leader of the Scottish Labour Party by saying, we all voted Labour last year or in 2024 in the general election. They've made a terrible mess of things. Vote Labour in 2026. It's not a message that's persuasive. But this is the problem that Labour find themselves in, and I think there is no way out of it for them. So the question, let me ask you this, Bernard. Generally speaking, there are two types of election. There's one where the electorate says, yeah, things are all right, happy to give the current lot another go. They may not be brilliant, but they're good enough. More of the same is okay, I can live with that. And then there's the other type of election, which is it's enough is enough, time for a change. And at that point, the question becomes not so much a referendum on the performance of the government, but on the question of is an opposition party good enough, credible enough to replace a discredited, unpopular incumbent? Which of these elections are we going to get in Scotland next year, or are we going to get some kind of hybrid or a completely different type of election?
I think we're going to get a completely different type of election. We're going to get a third type of election, which is that they're all broadly useless, but the current lot are in are slightly less useless than the others. I mean, I do actually think that that's going to be the dynamic, which sort of raises an interesting question about party strategy. Anas Sarwar has no option but to try and keep the entire election campaign on the record of the SNP government. So Anas Sarwar will fight the election on John Swinney. John Swinney will, I suppose, want to talk less about the record of the government. Well, he won't want to talk about the record of his own government, but he might want to talk about the record of the UK government. So he will fight it on Keir Starmer. And the Tories will be hoping beyond hope that the election is fought on the Constitution, and that somehow, because they got a boost after the referendum in 2014, when a section of the Unionist vote coalesced around the Conservatives because they perceived them as being more hardline in saying no to a second independence referendum. And if we throw Reform UK into the mix, what it does is that even if the Tories have tanked, and they will tank, and I think they will go down to an absolutely horrible drubbing next May, if the Unionist vote is split between Liberal Democrats, who are reviving compared to where they were at the last election, Labour might even fall back depending on how big the Reform vote is going to go, you have this situation where the SNP could sweep most of the constituencies, the overwhelming majority of the constituencies, despite the fact, compared to the last election, their share of the vote in the constituencies is massively down because the Unionist vote is so fragmented, which perhaps lets us into the thinking of John Swinney all of a sudden for talking up independence, because we were told after the Westminster general election, and some people within the party were saying, we have to stop talking about independence because it is not the number one priority of the voters. But the reason that Mr. Swinney is now keen to talk about independence, the reason at the most recent SNP conference there was even a strategy laid forward on independence, we can come back to that about how much of a strategy is. Why was it just over a year ago that this wasn't being talked about, but is now being talked about? Quite simply because the share in the polls that the SNP are currently getting is way down compared to support for Scottish independence. And in circumstances where the Unionist vote is hopelessly fragmented in the constituencies, if John Swinney can persuade people who broadly support independence that he's going to bang the independence drum, that may well assist him in keeping his share of the vote that bit higher. So a lot of politics and a lot of strategy always involves smoke and mirrors. So am I wrong in suggesting that all of the chat about independence currently coming from the Scottish Government isn't so much a real attempt with a real strategy to confront Westminster after the election? It's more about tactics to boost the share to mop up the first past the post constituency.
I mean, I agree with that entirely, but I mean, it's a Potemkin strategy and so on, designed to create the impression of activity and substance, where in actual fact there is absolutely nothing happening on the national question, because nobody seriously believes that the outcome of next year's election, whatever it is, however good it is for the SNP or the Greens and so on, even if you had a majority of MSPs elected who notionally favour independence and so on, nobody believes that that is going to actually bring about another referendum on independence. The salience of independence as an issue has dropped. It may well rise again in the future, but at the moment, all the chat within the SNP about a strategy, there isn't a strategy, is designed to shore up the SNP's core vote. And you know, you're absolutely right that with the more fragmented the electorate is, the easier it is for you to, if you like, have a disproportionate election result in a system that is designed to give you a proportionate result. So you could get something like 48, 49% of the seats on 35% of the vote, which isn't how it's supposed to work, but if the cards fall the right way, that you could have something like that. And that's fine, a win is a win, but it's not a mandate for national emancipation.
I mean, just on that issue, it does look as if we will have the most disproportional election of the devolved era. Now, the current additional member system that we had, I can remember the discussions which took place within the Scottish Constitutional Convention, and the late Dr. Bob Maclean, who was a very prominent Labour activist within the Scottish Labour Action Pressure Group, actually had a paper which he tabled in which he demonstrated that it would be possible to get to 65 seats without getting 50% or 50% plus of the votes. And in the Constitutional Convention at that time, there was no SNP. The Green Party had walked over the issue of the convention not being prepared to sanction a multi-option referendum. So you were effectively left with the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, the trade unions, and the churches and some civic organisations. COSLA. Yeah. And at the end of the day, they thought, well, let's not worry about that, because the Labour Party always assumed that if anyone was going to bust this system, it was going to be them, not the SNP. But it genuinely is a serious question if you believe in pure proportional representation. Do you want to almost get over the line? I mean, Keir Starmer has a Blair-like landslide on under 35% of the vote. And when you count in the number of voters who choose not to vote in an election, that's not a lot of people voting for you. So there isn't a great deal of debate at all about whether or not the voting system should be changed for the Holyrood Parliament. There might just be a debate after the election next year. And the irony of ironies is that near landslide in 2015, 56 out of 59 seats delivered by a first-past-the-post electoral system, that's what the SNP got. It's an electoral system that they don't actually agree with. And historically, they have never agreed with the additional member system either. They've always, like the Liberal Democrats, believed in the single transferable vote. So that might be one issue to look out for. But I suppose that the bigger issue in political terms is that, you know, we're now, by next year, we're going to be 27 years into devolution. And at the last Stevenson lecture, which was given by the Chief Executive Officer of the Scottish Parliament, David was speculating about how Donald Dewar would have viewed 27 years of devolution. Well, he would be 88 years of age now, and because he was a measured politician with his language, he would have been measured. I have absolutely no qualms whatsoever in saying that Donald Dewar would have regarded 27 years of devolution broadly as a failure, because he represented a parliamentary constituency which included Drumchapel and bits of the affluent West End. And his political philosophy could be summed up And he used to say it often that he was in politics to rewrite the social arithmetic, to ensure that children in Drumchapel had the same life chances as people in the West End of Glasgow. On that yardstick, Alex, my contention would be that in a lot of big issues, the Parliament, whoever has been in power these last 26 years, has failed. But are they likely to offer anything next year to put all of this in reverse?
Well, I mean, the short answer to that is probably not. I mean, but you're right. I mean, if you look at opinion polling and Scottish Social Attitude Survey findings and so on from the early years of devolution, you find 80, 85, almost 90% of people thinking well, yes, the Scottish Parliament can be trusted to look after our best interests and so on. It's going to represent Scotland well. It's going to deliver on the things that we would like it to. It's going to make meaningful change to people's lives. The most recent edition of that survey, I think, found that figure is now down to around 47% of people. So there's been, in some respects, you might say, well, this is understandable. The high hopes that arrived that were there in 1999 were unrealistic and unsustainable. But nevertheless, if you look at it over that sort of quarter century timeline, you see a progressive disenchantment, if you like, with it. And again, I think that is something that is mirrored in certain respects at a UK level with how people view the House of Commons. I think it's also viewed again in other Western European countries where there are real crises of legitimacy, particularly amongst established parties. Because, let me put it this way to you, Bernard. In 1999, the two biggest parties in the election, Labour and the SNP, combined to win around 70% of the vote. Next year, if the result mirrors current polling, which again has been pretty stable for the last time, the SNP will win around 35% of the constituency vote, and then whoever comes second, whether it's Labour or I think less probably Reform, may win around 20% of the vote. So the combined share of the vote is 55%. That's actually quite a significant change. What do you think is that a significant change in your view? Why has it happened? Is this something that will continue? Is it a problem? Is it a good thing?
Well, I mean, the Scottish Parliament was always, in a sense, in electoral terms, going to entrench a form of social democracy. I mean, not even the Conservatives in 1999 could foresee circumstances in which there would be a centre-right majority. And I'm going to be interested to see if anyone in the audience wants to offer a point of view in this. I mean, it does strike me that if you are a social democrat, and people in the SNP say they believe in social democracy, people in the Labour Party say they believe in social democracy.
Some of them.
Well, the Liberal Democrats, the long title of the party is the Social and Liberal Democrats. As to what extent the Parliament has been transformational. Why do we still have intergenerational poverty in a city like Glasgow? It doesn't seem to me that the Parliament has got to grips with this. The former Conservative Housing Minister in England, Nick Boles, I think correctly judged when he said the biggest issue of social justice in Britain today is the inability of young people to access housing. There's been a housing crisis for a quarter of a century, and I would have thought that if you were a social democrat, that should get you out of your bed in the morning, and yet housing policy has been fragmented. A couple of years ago, the Scottish Government cut it by £200 million, then they reinstated it, £196 million the next year. Looking after kids that come out of schools who don't have O grades, who are not going to go to university, who have to be equipped with vocational skills which marry what the economy needs, and yet 140,000 places cut in the sector. This doesn't strike me as being the actions of a social democrat. Endowing the middle classes with lots of things. Donald Dewar was against free personal care. He stood out against free personal care, and the then Health Secretary Susan Deakin discovered that it was effectively being foisted upon her because Henry McLeish did something to brand his administration on. It appears to me that all of them, every single social democratic party of the devolved era, hasn't governed towards social democratic ends, but they have governed towards narrow-minded electoral ends and their own survivability.
But Bernard, let me put this to you then. If we have had 27 years of ostensibly social democratic government, and if, as you say, and if I accept your premise here, if we've had 27 years of social democratic government and 27 years of social democratic government failing to achieve its own objectives, might it not be the case that the problem is social democracy?
Well, the problem is the people who are interpreting social democracy.
So it hasn't been tried properly. This is the old communism line, isn't it?
Look, I can see one or two people in the audience with a long political past who might want to pick you up ideologically on that. Look, there's a sense in which the post-war social democratic model of tax and spend your way to equality is probably one that doesn't work. But it was it not Aaron Bevan himself who said that socialism is the language of priorities? And you and I will both agree on this because it's one of the themes of the podcast. You cannot endow the middle classes with lots of things which arguably they do not need and make the assault on poverty that is required with finite resources. The most overused and abused phrase in politics today is we must do things in the national interest. No political party believes in the national interest. They believe in self-interest. And yet again, all the way along the line, you see politicians bottling tough decisions when they have to confront the electorate with uncomfortable realities. The current government, when they were elected in 2007, Mr Salmond and Miss Sturgeon were all over the boards in Scotland saying we will replace the unfair council tax. 18 years down the line, we are still waiting when over 60% of properties in Scotland are in the wrong band because they're based upon property valuations in 1991. It ain't fair. It should have been fixed. It wasn't. Why? Because if they'd attempted to fix it, they would have incurred the wrath of a certain section of the electorate who at that point had moved towards the SNP. Nothing to do with the national interest, all to do with self-interest. And what politicians today are very bad at is to say, we've got finite resources, we as a government have to set our priorities, and you need tough conversations with, treat the electorate as grown-ups. If you actually put it on the line and explain it to them, you might take them with you.
Well, maybe, but let me offer this provocation, perhaps, Bernard, in terms of next year's election result and so on. And let me ask you a simple question, which is: does it actually matter what the result is? And I say that because if you park the constitutional issue, if you put that to one side. I think it's reasonable to do so because there isn't likely to be any substantial movement on that any time in the short to medium term future. If you put that to one side, then what fundamentally is the difference between the SNP and the Labour Party in Scotland? Where is the ideological clash on the provision of public services, on the size of the state, what the state ought to be doing? It seems I would suggest to you that they are both big government statist parties that agree on a good 80% of what either of them would say at a certain fundamental level. They have to pretend to disagree furiously a lot of the time, of course, but neither of them looks at a situation where public spending in and for Scotland, as I've noted on the podcast before, is now equivalent to 55% of onshore GDP. That's amongst the highest in Europe. Do we have public services commensurate with that level of spending, which is now rebranded as investment? I would suggest no, we do not. So, if you were to replace, however fantastical it might be next year, a SNP government of one sort or another with a Labour government or a government led by Labour of one sort or another, what would actually change?
Not a lot. I think that's the honest answer to that. Not a lot. You said if we could park the constitutional question. I know that it's impossible for people to park the constitutional question, but in some respects, the most natural coalition in the Scottish Parliament is Labour and the SNP. And when Alex raises the issue about the size of the state, the shape of the state, you get back to that very traditional ideological debate about means and ends. We know what the end game of social democracy is. It's greater social justice. It's about ensuring that people who are poor have some life chances. The argument is always over the means. Now, in the post-war period, it was always the extent to which you had nationalisation, Clause 4, Part 4 of the Labour Party Constitution. Hugh Gaitskell fought a conference over it in '59 and all the rest of it. If these parties believe in a socially just Scotland, it is truly astonishing that in 26 years the basic shape of the Scottish state has not changed, that there has been no proper debate about whether or not the 32 local authority model is the correct model, the existing territorial health board model is their own model, local enterprise companies and all of this stuff. How do you get a bang for your buck? Because it comes back to the point. The problem is that when you reform a lot, and we're in a university here, wow, there's some big questions over the future of universities.
Well, let's not intrude on private grief too much, Bernard.
The big questions over the future of universities, and yet no serious debate about means and ends. And that does, I think, point to a certain dearth of thinking. And when I look at the churn of experience that will be exiting Holyrood, and I sort of look through at the candidates that are coming in, I am not filled with enthusiasm that it will be a hothouse of intellect and reform.
Well, I don't think it'll be any worse than the previous ones, Bernard. So, perhaps I'm more optimistic on this than you are. But we're probably coming towards the end of this part of the show. What's your? I'm going to ask you, make your prediction for what the actual outcome is going to be next year.
I
perhaps should have warned you before we started recording that I might ask you that.
Right. I think the SNP will be the largest party. I don't think Reform will come second because I think that under the scrutiny of an election campaign, and what we're going to get, incidentally, is that anything that Nigel Farage has been anywhere near in the past, there are always candidates who during the course of the election are found to have eccentric views on a whole series of things, and I think there will be a run on their credibility. I think that they will have to sort of spell out where they stand. They're not going to get through an election campaign on the basis of just tapping into a mood. I suspect that Labour will get their act together sufficiently to keep the attention on the record of the SNP government, and that they will come second. I think Reform will almost certainly come third, and the Tories will be a long way back. I suppose, and I generally don't know the answer to this, are we talking 48 SNP seats, 55, 60? I don't know, but I think they'll be the largest party.
I think that's quite clear. I mean, John Swinney is many things, but one of the things he is a safe politician. That is to say, there are lots of people over the long period of SNP administration, which is now poised to enter its third decade, which is an extraordinary thing to contemplate in many ways. In normal circumstances, just as the general election last year was a moment for what I would term a necessary moment of democratic hygiene. The Conservatives had to be removed from office because they'd been in there for longer than was good for them or the country. In ordinary circumstances, you would think it would be good for Scotland in this instance to have a change of government at Holyrood, even if it didn't actually amount to very much of a change in policy terms, just for a kind of sort of renewal and hygiene thing. But the thing about John Swinney is that he doesn't frighten or terrify voters who are not well disposed to the SNP. They might not like him very much, but they find it much easier to live with him, put up with him, than they did with either of his two immediate predecessors. And that is a great strength, to be a point of stability in a time of quite febrile and fragmented politics is an enormous strength. Even if you are only winning 35% of the vote, you are then still well placed to be, if you like, the tallest midget in the room. And that is how I would expect the SNP to come out of next year's election.
Yeah, and you know, Harold Wilson, back in the 1960s, had an ambition to make Labour the natural party of government. And when you look at the elections over a long period of time now, I think that you have to conclude that, as regards Scotland, the SNP are the natural party of government because they keep winning. They keep winning despite the electoral systems that are in place, and they are likely to win next year. But we've probably bored our audience enough.
Probably, but even where the SNP don't win, they come second. Yeah. You know, I mean, I don't think there's a single constituency in Scotland where the SNP finish as poorly as third, and that, you know, they're the only national party now, not just because it's in their title and so on. You know, the Tories have been forced into retreats along the sort of in the northeast and the cordon sanitaire along the border. The Labour Party has no presence in rural Scotland. The Lib Dems have 5 or 6 seats that they're a power in. The Greens are largely a metropolitan party in constituencies such as Glasgow Hill Head and so on. And Reform are probably the closest thing to a national party after the SNP, and that is perhaps itself a commentary on the failures of the political process, the political establishment more generally.
Even when the Conservatives got 50% of the popular vote at the UK general election in 1955, and when Labour were dominant for so many years, they weren't, in that sense, in my view, as dominant as the SNP, who are a party of the north, the south, the west, the east, the urban, rural, and across all social classes. It's truly been a remarkable journey to watch in political terms, and I'll leave with one final thought. Probably Mr. Salmon's legacy and not Miss Sturgeon's.
Right. Thank you both so much. I think we're going to open this up for questions, and whilst people contemplate what they want to ask, I will abuse my privilege in the chair. So, Bernard, you talking about legacy of Donald Dewar and the idea of changing the social arithmetic. One thing that has, of the several innovations in the Scottish Parliament over the years, votes at 16. This was one of the things that was supposed to, sort of innovate and be progressive in some ways. And of course, we see votes at 16 now coming in down south as well, in various places. So, what will be the offer to young voters coming up in 2026? Or will there even be an offer to young voters coming up in 2026?
Very briefly, they will pledge to keep free bus passes for 22-year-olds and under. Current cost, the last time I looked, £190 million in a country which should be making hard choices. And when I was at school, by the way, I wasn't clamouring for a free bus pass. That, of course, was a product of the relationship with the Greens, and they will pledge to keep tuition fees free, as indeed I think Labour and the Lib Dems will as well. Nobody is going near that one, despite the fact some university principals would like them.
Well, the Tories are beginning to say, well, hang on a minute, actually, free tuition is one of those policies that sounds lovely, there's an obvious upside for those who benefit from it, but it does actually come at significant cost. Now, I don't think that they're going to be brave enough to recommend reintroducing. Well, possibly, but the Tories are now in a really weird position because nobody expects them to have any kind of opportunity to be in power. or even to really influence the arithmetic of the next Parliament too much. The Tories are then in a weird situation where, although most parties that aspire to be in government have to compromise with the electorate, the Tories are now so unpopular that there is an opportunity for them to say, to hell with the electorate, they're wrong, this is what we think is right, and over a prolonged period of time, in theory, build a level of support for Conservative ideas, even if that doesn't immediately translate into support for Conservative candidates. Now, I'm not suggesting that Russell Findlay and his team are capable of doing this, but you could see from, if you like, the perspective of right-of-centre politics in Scotland, that there is an opportunity for someone to do that. The question is, can you actually command sufficient attention to achieve anything with it, and who's going to do it? And those are two problems to which the Conservatives obviously have no answer at the moment.
Right. If you catch my eye, or we'll go to Sir John first.
So we have Sir John Curtice who's going to tell us that all the things we've said about polls and so on have been completely wrong.
It happened to me many times.
Not at all, actually. I want to pick up the second half of what you were talking about the Scottish state and about the Social Democratic project. I have a couple of points. I mean, one, essentially to Alex, is it's fine to bemoan the size of the Scottish state, but given the current devolution settlement, the size of the Scottish state is effectively determined primarily by decisions made at Westminster. And of course, the reason why the state is as big as it is because of decisions made by the last Conservative government that resulted in the biggest increase in the state since 1945. But coming then to Bernard's kind of cry about, well, look, we've had this institution and it's not been meeting its social democratic mission. Well, one of the points that James Mitchell made very early on in the days of devolution was that, yes, sure, that there is this aspiration that perhaps the Scottish Parliament would be able to reflect an allegedly more social democratic electorate, though whether that's true we can debate. But that certainly was one of the aspirations. But what James went on to say, of course, is that but the problem is that the powers that Parliament has been given are not really the policy powers that are required to have a chance of doing that. Of course, one of the things that's happened since the independence referendum is that the two big powers, domestic powers, that were denied effectively to Holyrood, one, taxation, and two, welfare, are now, at least to some degree, within its remit. And what's happened? Well, we've actually seen that we have a somewhat more progressive system of income tax in Scotland than we do south of the border. And on welfare, I mean, arguably the biggest discretionary financial decision that's been made in recent years, which receives very, very little controversy, we don't see even the Conservative Party complaining about it, is the decision to set up the Scottish Child Payment. And that, again, is clearly designed very much to try to reduce poverty. So arguably, Bernard, I think we do need to think about the more recent period, and the arguably quite difficult and debatable choices have been made, but they are certainly ones that one would argue has gone rather closer towards an attempt to realise the social democratic project.
Do you want to deal with the issue of the size of the state?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Scotland is in a very fortunate position. It has enormous public spending that doesn't all have to be funded by taxpayers in Scotland, because the Barnett formula is the gift which keeps on giving as far as Scotland is concerned. If Scotland had to SNP policy at the moment within the United Kingdom is still technically for full fiscal autonomy. A really bold UK government would say, yeah, okay, we're up for that. Voters in the south of England in particular are definitely up for that. We'll give you what you want. Good luck closing the £10 billion funding hole that would result as a consequence of turning off the Barnett taps. So this is one of the reasons why there isn't much of a debate, I think, about the size and role of the state in Scotland is precisely because it doesn't all actually have to be funded by taxpayers in Scotland, despite the legislative changes and so on in terms of income tax and so on. So, Scotland is really unusual within the UK. It is the only part of the UK that is wealthy but funded in terms of the public sector as though it was one of the poorest parts of the UK. And so in that sense, it ought to have, you might think, the best of all possible worlds. And yet, you ask voters around the country and so on, are you happy with how politics is delivering for you in Scotland? And the answer tends to be no, and that is as true in middle-class communities as it is in working-class communities.
I think Sir John's right in the issue of the Scottish Child Payment. It is the one demonstrable legacy of Nicola Sturgeon's time as First Minister, although two Cabinet Secretaries told me privately that she had to really be persuaded in order to back it. And it has lifted children out of poverty. And there's a lot of pressure on Rachel Reeves to lift the two-child benefit cap, which again, throughout the UK, would lift children out of poverty. And the initial welfare reforms, badly handled, politically bungled last year, and the $5 billion worth of savings, were going to put children into poverty. So that is an entirely fair point in which you make. I do come back to my point about hard choices. When the policy of free personal care, so Stuart Sutherland, then principal of Edinburgh University, was the individual who chaired the group that recommended it. The price tag that was put on that at that time was £140 million. But everybody knew that the way the demographics were going, that this was going to double, treble, quadruple over a period of time. And the reason why Donald Dewar opposed free personal and nursing care was that he recognised that reality, and the reality also was that the very poorest pensioners actually got it. So when he asks himself the question about rewriting the social arithmetic, are we going to spend hundreds of millions of pounds and effectively for not all, but for some pensioners, which is a subsidy for the middle classes, when that money will not be available to do other things? I think maybe to sort of answer Alex's point about what is the nature of the social democratic contract with the electorate. In the post-war period, it was to endow them with a welfare state. It was to say that there's a role for government where the market cannot or will not go. It was to establish a social floor below which no citizen should fall. It just strikes me that the parties of the centre-left have been very bad at redefining how that social contract, in the context of a changing demography, what it should look like, who the citizens are that should benefit, and critically how you pay for it. Because as Sir John said in relation to the welfare budget, we already know what the Auditor General has said, that by financial year 29-30, there will be a black hole of almost £5 billion in the Scottish Government's budget, which brings us to a point, is any party at the election going to talk about that reality? No, they ain't.
No, of course not. Of course not. But the logic of it is all perfectly respectable from an electoral point of view and so on, because it turns out, and this is a truly shocking development and so on, that if you offer people free stuff, they're going to say, well, yeah, I don't mind having a bit of that. I like that. I don't want to pay for stuff. And that is true whether they need the stuff or not, whether they can afford the stuff or not. And so you get into this kind of Dutch auction, if you like. The Scottish Labour Party are clearly going to have a couple of offers to the electorate next spring. I would be astonished if they are not essentially versions of what the SNP is already doing. And so, here, vote Labour and we'll give you this on top of what the SNP is offering and so on, which will only encourage the problems that you're rightly talking about there in terms of the longer term fiscal sustainability of the Scottish Government. And so on, a £5 billion shortfall by 2030 is actually a really significant amount in terms of a day-to-day budget of what resource spending is, what are currently around a bit over £60 billion. So it'll be higher by the end of the decade, but it's a really significant hole that is opening up, and it's in nobody's interests between now and an election next May to talk about how that might be filled.
Right, we have a gentleman over there. If anybody wants to raise a question, just catch my eye. Raise your hand.
Thank you for this very interesting discussion. I have a question for Bernard. You used the word scrutiny, and you suggested that Reform UK might not come in second because when the party is under scrutiny, it might lose support. That reveals a faith in scrutiny and in the power of journalism, and I would like to join you there, but I'm not sure that we can have that faith, and I'm saying that based on developments over the last decade over in the United States. They have a president in the United States who has been under scrutiny, one of the most fact-checked probably persons in the world. That doesn't seem to have undermined support for him. And one might suggest even that lying is rewarded by a large part of the electorate that sees defying norms or breaking norms as a sign of authenticity, of willingness to build bridges, to burn bridges with the establishment. He's on our side. He lies. He breaks those norms of political decorum, for example, or civil discourse. That means that he will defend our interests. So I wonder, you being on the ground and talking to people in Scotland, if you have a sense that we can keep that power, the faith in the power of scrutiny, or will people just say, the system has let me down and I'm just going to support the politician that is willing to break the norms imposed by the system that doesn't work for me?
I think there's 2 points there. There's the issue of have Reform UK been scrutinised enough, and then there's the second one, which is a much wider question on effectively people believing in sort of lies, and lies now or misinformation being the currency of debate. Let's take the second one first. And it's been really sort of difficult one because everybody will have seen the crisis that the BBC have been in over recent weeks. And one of the issues, if you are a public service broadcaster, if people cease to trust you, then you're finished. You're absolutely finished. Now, on the issue of public service broadcasters, every political party at some stage has had problems with public service broadcasters. As somebody who worked in the system for over 35 years, I know that only too well. Harold Wilson had his problems with the BBC, refused to be interviewed by David Dimbleby because of a 1971 documentary called Yesterday's Men. Margaret Thatcher had her problems with the BBC over a panorama programme called Maggie's Militant Tendency and over the way in which they covered events in Northern Ireland. You see the polarisation around the war in the Middle East, where some people believe that it's completely and utterly partial. And the problem is that, and this is, I think, where public service broadcasting is in a really perilous state at the moment. The stuff that was put out by Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative Party leader, last week, would never have been put out by a previous Conservative leader. I noticed that Rishi Sunak, I think it was actually in the Times, who was making a bit of a defence for public service broadcasting. It now appears that the political mainstream, growing up people who ought to know better, now take the view that the mainstream media, and that term in itself is bandied about as a term of abuse, tell lies. And particularly with younger people who access news in a different way, the danger is that you gravitate towards having your misinformation reconfirmed. And we really, I think, do stand in a precipice where all might be lost, and I don't think, and I think that might be fairly quickly. On the point about the scrutiny of Reform UK, it's pretty difficult sometimes to scrutinise when the only thing they're punting is a mood and not a series of policies. But what they will need to do next year is to come up with a manifesto, and things will be thrown at Reform UK brackets Scotland about everything that Mr Farage has said in the past, from the scrapping of the Barnett formula, which was UKIP's policy, which would have been an absolute disaster for the income of the Parliament. So you will get the scrutiny.
Yeah. I mean, the problem for reform and so on is that at the moment they'd benefit from not having policies. And the last thing reform need in Scotland is policies and people to sell them. Because both of these are going to end up being a disappointment. They now have an MSP, Graham Simpson, who defected from the Conservative parties. Now, at a convention of undertakers, Graham Simpson is the downbeat kind of guy. You can't put him on the television and so on and expect voters to come flocking to the Reform banner. Similarly, Reform are going to have some scrutiny of their candidates, many of whom are going to be complete fruitcakes. And their policies. Again, the last thing Reform needs in Scotland is policies and so on, because what they benefit from is being a kind of blank canvas onto which disappointed voters can project their own frustrations. And so fact-checking Reform, especially when nobody expects them to be in government, is no more better use of anyone's time than fact-checking the Green Party. Although actually the Green Party, of course, have been in government in Scotland, so it would be sensible to pay more attention to their own relatively extreme policies on a lot of issues too. But more generally, I think I understand why people think this way, but there's a terrible overestimation of the power of the media. The media doesn't tell people how to vote. The media doesn't really lead voters either. Much of the time, there's a very sort of elaborate and intricate dance between newspapers and television stations, particularly newspapers, and voters, where sometimes the voters or the consumers of news are leading the media, and that happens much more often, or just as often, as the media leading news consumers. The notion that if only we had a better set of newspapers or better television journalists or whatever, everything would be better and different and so on, I don't think that actually applies.
I think just on the television point as well, it's when I started off, I presented leaders' debates programs for over 30 years, and in that time, if you looked at the numbers who were actually watching these programs, they've tended to drift over the years. It didn't go down the way in 2014. The independence referendum, the first debate between Salmond and Darling, which I presented at the
It did much better than the one that the BBC did, didn't it? It did better numbers, but you might as well just come out and say so.
It didn't actually do better numbers, but it did 950,000, and it was on the 5th of August between 8 and 10, and 950,000 is the kind of audience that you would expect for a Celtic Rangers football match. So those were huge.
Well, it was a similar dynamic, actually, given the loading between the two sides by that stage of affairs.
The debate on the 1997 referendum before the Scottish Parliament 2 question referendum, we did again 8 to 10. At that time, it was the biggest outside broadcast for a current affairs show in Scotland. It was 3 aside. 2-hour live debate, Donald Dewar, Alex Salmond, Jim Wallace against Michael Ancram, Tam Dalziel and Donald Finlay. And again, the figures were up at almost 1 million. These are huge. Your nightly news programmes, Reporting Scotland is currently down to around 200,000 a night. STV News probably a little bit more, which is why you're getting all of these changes now at the BBC, because I used to always sit with my head in my hands at editorial meetings when they said, we have to make the output more accessible. And that invariably means dumbed down, and I feel that's where it's headed.
Well, while we're on the information ecosystem around the upcoming election, you've talked about misinformation. So misinformation being somebody gets something wrong and then it gets sort of spread a lot and these sorts of things. We've had several warnings over the last several months. Full Fact did a report on this, and they're quite concerned about disinformation. We saw in the Irish election the deep fake about Catherine Connolly sort of supposedly pulling out of the election about 3 days before, that went viral, and people reported that they were actually surprised that she was still on the ballot. They fell for it. They thought that she had fallen out. So with Full Fact and other organizations worrying about disinformation in this upcoming election, with us seeing it in Denmark and Ireland and other places. How do we deal with those sorts of things, and what's the role, because you often talk in your podcast about the role of the contemporary sort of journalism? What
You can't deal with it. Or the only way you can deal with it is by taking the Chinese approach and switching off the internet. Or ensuring that the only internet sites people can visit are those approved by the state. You can't do it in a liberal democracy and an open society. I think there are reasonable questions to be asked about whether in the long term, whether liberal democracy is actually compatible with the internet. I don't have the answer to that and so on, but I think there are increasing grounds for suspecting that no, it isn't.
Yeah, I don't think you can deal with it either. I have never tweeted in my life. What a thing for a journalist to say. I have never tweeted in my life. And when I was told internally, you must tweet, you're a face of the station or whatever it was, and I said, I will not be tweeting. I can find no useful use of my time to be engaging with people who really just want to abuse you at the end of the day. My approach to when I was doing my job was that, look, it is our responsibility to give everybody a fair crack of the whip. It is our responsibility to report accurately, and it is our responsibility to call out where politicians are making claims which don't stand up. And long-form interviews with politicians at election time try to do that. So you would get Labour Party, ridiculous stuff like mandatory jail sentences for everyone found carrying a knife. There's only one problem with that. There is only 8,500 prison places in the prison estate, and like 20,000 people were found carrying a knife by the police in any 1 year. So if you get something which is just demonstrably rubbish and doesn't stand up, your public service to the public is to point this out. And that, of course, means a certain amount of tension with the politicians. But it's not our job to be partial. I never once got out of my bed in all the years that I did it and thought, whose line am I punting today? It never crossed my mind. It crossed the minds of quite a lot of people who were watching that I was doing somebody's bidding because they would write and say so. The only thing you can do is to try and stay true to the public service broadcast ethos and hope that it cuts through, but I fear it's wasting it.
Yeah. I mean, Twitter is fine, Bernard, once you've taken the precaution of blocking a statistically significant portion of the Scottish electorate. Then it can be quite nice.
So we have one here, and then we'll come to the front.
Thanks very much. It's an interesting discussion. I have to say, I think you're both wrong about social media. It's in fact, I don't think we can sit around and just sort of think we just need to do better, or we need to kind of expand our forum for discussions and get better quality discussion, that kind of stuff. That's just not the work. We're not in that context anymore.
Can I just ask you what? Play devil's advocate. Why do you think that?
Sorry.
Why do you think we've got it wrong in social media?
Because I just think the context has changed. I mean, it's just, we're not putting the genie back in the box, The economic context has changed, the media landscape's fractured, people get their news from memes that their pals share, and that's the way it is. What we need to do is work out how to, strengthen ourselves from there. But I disagree with Alex in saying you can't do anything about it. I think you can. What we've done is we've put the power of publishing into every single person's pocket. Everyone is a publisher. There are rules that relate to publishing, but we're not applying those rules. So I think there are things that could be done, but we're not approaching that either. I suppose my observation is around kind of perhaps we need to be looking at more radical ways of operating our democracy. So involving citizens more in making decisions, things like citizens' juries, which have been used to kind of deal or set contexts for difficult decisions in Ireland and other places. Maybe I don't have all those solutions, but there will be people in universities and other places that will have kind of ideas around how we can maybe involve citizens more, and that would help to strengthen some of our institutions. But I guess my other sort of little point that which kind of is linked, is that one person who has seemed to have been using social media and is getting a bit of a bump from it is Zach Polanski down south. He's having an impact in the way that he's operating on social media and the way that his, you know, you could say he's like a reform person in that he's like bringing a fresh idea, he's untested, you know, some of the policies are uncredible, you know, but, you know, he is attracting a certain percentage of people down south. He is attracting kind of disillusioned Labour voters who are looking at Polanski and looking at the Greens, and understand that in Scotland we're in a different dynamic because there's also the SNP and the, you know, so there are different options for people. But you've not mentioned the Greens at all up here, and they do have two new leaders, kind of new, and will they get some sort of Polanski boost? And you know, how will that play in? Will there be, you know, do you think people will be sort of drifting towards, or young people, in fact, that you talked about, will they be sort of thinking about Greens rather than some of the established parties and not reform?
Yeah, well, the polling suggests exactly that young people who are easily impressed, you know, are exactly, you know, perfectly happy to grant the Greens an unwarranted amount of house room. You know, and they will, I think, benefit from the sort of Polanski overspill effect, particularly on social media as well, and so on. And the whole point about Polanski is to say, you know, essentially, why should the right and Farage have a monopoly on cranks and misfits and weirdos? You know, left-wing equivalent versions of these people need a home too, and we're here for that. And, you know, yes, that is quite popular at the moment. But that, again, you know, speaks to the erosion of trust and credibility of the established parties in the centre. And again, this is not just a UK phenomenon. You know, you can look at France, you can look at Germany, you can look at a whole range of other countries and so on, and see similar dynamics taking place there. And that's why I do actually think that if you take a 40-year view of these things and so on, I do actually think that liberal democracy and the values of an open society are actually on much shakier, weaker foundations than they have been at any point since the Second World War.
I think the Scottish Greens will do well next year. I expect them to make some progress. There is a new leadership team. I think actually a more marketable leadership team. I mean, Alec and I have both on the podcast said that, and as you can tell, Alec is not a fan, that Patrick Harvie was an extremely effective political leader. I, in a sort of different guise today, was interviewing Ross Greer for an hour, a 1 hour interview, and I said to him, and I said, what's your political philosophy? And he defined himself as a socialist. During the interview, he name-checked both Jimmy Reid and John McClain. And I found this really rather fascinating because I thought, you sound like someone who was a teenager in the 1970s or the 1980s, because in a sense, these great debates about where do you stand in the relationship between Labour and capital, it was almost as if he could have been a member of the Labour left circa 1970, and yet he is a Green. And I think, and I'm going to stick my neck out here, why not? He is somebody to watch out for, because I do believe that he is going to broaden the appeal of the Greens, which is broader than just environmental politics and human rights. I think he's really going to get it into the sort of old-fashioned post-war sort of class questions as well. He's the kind of individual that before there was a Green movement would have been in the Labour Party in the 60s and 70s, may well have joined the SNP in the 90s. But interesting that I was very, very impressed with him today. Not many people, I think, do I meet at that age who have quite that political terrain. So I think he's one to watch out for.
Yeah, Greer is intelligent and so on, and he believes in what he says, and that is that kind of authenticity is a significant advantage in the current climate and so on, because it also means that you could say, well, this is what I believe and so on. If you don't like it, fine, and you don't have to make the kind of compromises that if you're a party of government like the Labour Party is, or even the SNP is, and so on. You know, you don't have to make those kind of compromises that they have to do. And so Polanski south of the border and so on. The Green Party is now polling about 15% in some polls. We'll see how long that lasts. But what the dynamic there, and I think we see a little bit of it here in Scotland as well, is it's Corbynism without Jeremy, and Corbynism without Jeremy has to be more popular than Corbynism with Jeremy.
Right, so we have two questions in the queue, one here front and then just behind. Just to note, we have a dynamic with the Stevenson question sessions where everybody waits until the last minute to put their hand up. So if you feel a question coming on, put your hand up. It's kind of hard for me to see with these lights, so make sure you put your hand up and catch my eye, and then we'll come to you.
Yeah, I mean, when you began, there was some reference to your east-west divide that you both represent personally from between Glasgow and Edinburgh. But it seems to me, and I think to many other people living in Glasgow, that devolution and the centring of the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh has in many ways widened that divide. Edinburgh was always the financial and legal centre. It's now become very much the political centre. It's developed as a great metropolis, a wonderful tourist centre, and it looks marvellous, and it's a lovely place to visit. And Glasgow looks as if it's visibly declined. And most people in Glasgow at the moment think it has visibly declined. I have a sister who lives in South Wales, and she says exactly the same thing has happened in Wales, that Cardiff has ascended while poor Swansea, which was the industrial centre, has descended. Does that reflect the kind of divisions that are simply in Scotland at the moment? The other thing I wanted to comment on, which was an observation more than anything, let's shorthand all the free things that go on in Scotland. Some of it is pork barrel politics. Nobody now is prepared to stand up and say that your, programme of social democracy will actually depend on making those choices about free university education. Where in the developed world does it go on in the way it goes on in Scotland now? About free prescriptions, about free personal care, free bus travel for the over 60s, free bus passes up to the age of 22. This is the economics of the madhouse in a democratic society that aims for some degree of equalisation between those who have poorer prospects in lives and those who don't. But who is going to gainsay it among the political class that we have at the moment?
Well, I agree with that observation, because I think I made that observation. I have no problems with politicians saying that they want to keep, and of course these things are not free because they're paid for by taxpayers' money, so they're not free. Again, I come back to my point, what is the language of priorities? What means most to you? And I think that the obligation on government is to create the economic conditions in which citizens can work. We now have this chronic issue in terms of, and to skill particularly kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, to give them some opportunity in life. If they cannot afford housing because the market value is simply too high, it is the job of the state to step in, but it cannot do everything. So Social Democrats need a new social contract, and they need to say how they will pay for it, and they can't do what I would regard as worthwhile things and continue with middle-class subsidies. On the Glasgow to Edinburgh point, I don't think it's a case that Glasgow's declined because the political centre is in Edinburgh. The curious thing is that devolution has been with us since 1999, and we haven't been very good at devolving after those structures. The 129 MSPs do not run a thing. They do not run a single service. They pass laws and they divvy up money, but the 1,200 councillors in Scotland actually run frontline services, and again, local government has taken a disproportionate hammering when SNP ministers have been making priorities. Local government, real services to real communities, taken an absolute hammering, and nobody has actually said, how do we devolve further from Holyrood? 32 local authorities the size of East Ayrshire and Clackmannanshire, left alone.
Well, I mean, of course, you don't want, there's no point in creating a devolved parliament in Edinburgh to gather up a whole load of powers that had previously been held by the Secretary of State for Scotland and a couple of ministers. There is no point in creating this Parliament with those powers if you then go and give them away to people further down the political food chain. Of course, it seems to me quite obvious that all of Scotland's cities, and I would go further to include towns as well, and so on, would benefit from directly elected provosts, because at least you would then have a single recognisable figure who'd be responsible for local government, be somebody who could be held accountable, but could also be somebody who could help deliver things for the cities in particular. I think at a broader level, you're right that Edinburgh has benefited. That's partly because of broader economic trends, particularly towards services and leisure, that it has advantages in that Glasgow didn't have to the same degree. But there's been a broader problem, a failure, I think, over the last 25 years to recognise that although Edinburgh and Glasgow are both great cities and very different and in all sorts of ways, they are fundamentally, or should only be, half an hour apart, and should really be a single labour market and a single housing market. And the kind of infrastructure programming that would have delivered that has simply not happened. And as a result of that, we have lost out on a lot of the multiplying effects that come from scale in urban metropolitan environments. And that is increasingly clear that scale really does matter in these things in terms of multiplying factors, agglomeration and clustering and so on. And we haven't actually thought about that in a really serious way in Scotland, and we certainly haven't done anything to deliver the opportunities that there are, or that there should be for that, because Edinburgh and Glasgow should be one city in that sense as an economic unit.
And just one final thought on that. One of the arguments against devolution is you can't have devolution, because if you have devolution, it'll look like a bigger Strathclyde Regional Council. From 75 to 95, it only had 3 leaders: Dick Stewart, Charlie Gray and Bob Gould. It had 3 chief executives: Lawrence Boyle, Robert Calderwood and Neil McIntosh. Only to have that back now.
Bernard is going on Celebrity Mastermind, his specialist subject and so on is local government in Scotland 1975 to 95.
So we have 2 questions in the queue. I would propose that we take both of them and then
we can ignore the one we don't want to answer. Yeah.
You can be creative. Since your answers are so pithy, I figured that's probably the best way to do it. So.
Yeah, I suspect there's an element of mischief in Alex's suggestion that the problem lies with social democracy, but I'd like to counter it by suggesting in turn that there is no cogent representation of social democracy in the present political spectrum. The truth of the matter is that if you looked at the classic right-wing theorists of social democracy, like Crosland, Hattersley, they would look at Starmer and Reeves and their politics with blank incomprehension. The SNP has, basically those who tried to give the SNP a social democratic framework, like Stephen Maxwell, are long gone, and that framework with it, since the SNP opted for the neoliberal surge. I would suggest that the radical element that might shake up the present lesser evilism that we're confronted with for the coming elections might be just a cogent presentation of social democracy as those of us who are now rather elderly socialists might remember.
I wanted to pick up on a comment that you briefly made. Sounds like there are differing views. To note that at current count, approximately 39 MSPs have announced that they're standing down, and that number could certainly go up by choice or by scandal, and there might be more who choose not to stand. and it's been noted that a significant number of them are women, including arguably capable women who are currently in the cabinet. In Holyrood, there's been quite a heavy legislative agenda. The committee business is legislation, legislation, legislation. We need a new bill to send a message, is something that some MSPs like saying. And when you get new MSPs, they like to come up with a members' bill to be seen to be doing something, I'm sure for important reasons. Is there a scunner factor, not only in your electorate, but amongst some at Holyrood? Is there a tiredness that backbenchers have to do a lot of work because of the numbers of government and need to go to committees, sometimes sit on more than one committee, and bills can have hundreds of amendments in some cases? And what are your predictions, your hopes or fears for the future in terms of the next set of MSPs if some of the parties that are coming in don't like scrutiny and aren't interested in policy?
Well, shall I take that one, but
Yeah.
Well, look, I mean, MSPs like to complain they're overworked, but they're not. The Parliament sits 3 days a week, 8 months of the year. That is not an onerous schedule by any stretch of the imagination. Now, I think one could make a compelling case for the fact that it sits too frequently, and that Scotland might be better governed if we adopted the model of the Texas state legislature, which only meets every second year. Now, I confess that would be bad news for newspaper columnists to a certain degree, but I'm willing to take one for the national interest, if you like, on that front. There is a problem with the quality of legislation that is put through the Parliament. And so when you look at the number of government bills that have had to be withdrawn or abandoned because they've been found to be unworkable, whether, say, the offensive behaviour at football bill is an obvious example of that. Named person legislation, another example, or because, and although actually this applies to named person as well, it was both unworkable and contrary to the law in certain respects, which has been a further problem for government bills over the last 10 years or so, and a surprising problem, you might think, given the civil service muscle that the government ought to be able to work with and so on. But I think one of the other problems is that we've seen that the civil service in Scotland is not the Rolls-Royce civil service of legend. And so you have a real problem of capability within the Parliament, but also then within the government and the civil service. And these things combine to produce very muddled, badly thought out legislation that then has to be completely rewritten at various points through its legislative journey. So something like the hate crime bill that was passed bears very little resemblance to the hate crime bill that was initially put before Parliament. Now, you might say that it was improved, but it was not a particularly compelling example of good parliamentary practice. The only way to change that and so on is to elect better people. But it's quite difficult to think of any kind of list of policies and so on that would guarantee such an outcome. I'm not sure that even doubling MSP pay would necessarily do much to improve the quality of representative, even if the public would wear such a policy. And I have a sneaking suspicion that the public would look askance at MSPs being paid £150,000 a year.
I actually agree with Stuart. I mean, the British Labour Party has always been an ideological contradiction, in a sense, between Clause 4 socialists and Fabian's Social Democrats, Croslandite Social Democrats. And to a certain extent, when ideological tensions take place, it's a tension between these two different traditions. But what each tradition can do is to say, this is our view of society, this is our end game, and these are the policies that we believe are necessary in order to get there. And, you know, if Charles Anthony Raven Crosland was the leading social democratic thinker with his book, The Future of Socialism in '56, I'll throw a name at you. I know that you'll know him, Stuart Holland, former MP for Vauxhall, who did the same on the Labour left, whether you agreed with them or disagreed with them. And it was because people in Labour had ideological anchors that they would not compromise, that allowed people like Roy Hattersley and Dennis Healey to be regarded on the political right. And by 1997, when Tony Blair became Prime Minister, had ended up on the far left without altering their view of the world one iota. And the reason that Starmer will go down is quite simple. If you believe in things and you have ideological anchors and you believe it with a passion, it will get you through a crisis. Because at the end of the day, what you believe happens to be an article of faith. And if you have no ideological anchors and you have no appreciation of the movement that you lead, you'll be forced out.
Which may be why, according to one poll recently, and this is a quite remarkable, truly astonishing achievement for the Prime Minister, he now has an approval rating that is comparable to that enjoyed by Andrew Mountbatten Windsor.
On that note.
Well, on that note, we have to sort of end this particular podcast. I'd like to thank the University of Glasgow for giving us the opportunity to come along. Thank you to the audience for coming along and for their questions. But until next we see you, that's it for this edition. It's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.